A dense layer of fog had settled over Blackwood Creek like a leaden blanket. The very existence of this town, nestled in the cold geography of North America, was the dull, grey tone of forgetfulness. On one side stood the dark walls of endless pine forests, and on the other, the silhouettes of gloomy buildings, burdened by the weight of ancient secrets. This silent town resembled neither heaven nor hell. It merely represented an inevitable cycle. Tony Hawthorne was 25, and after a long absence, he had been forced to return to Blackwood Creek. He had seen the brightness of the outside world, but his mother's relentless illness had called him back to this bleak town he despised. Although their home held warm memories of his childhood, every corner now carried an unnerving silence. That evening, he was working in the dimly lit butcher shop's basement. Mr. Eldridge, the town's grumpiest, hardest-looking man, was the only one who would hire Tony. As Tony scraped off disgusting meat scraps, his mind was fixated on the missing person poster pinned to the town square's bulletin board. Sarah Jenkins, a 14-year-old, red-haired girl, the town's latest victim, and her disappearance was a definite sign that the 7-year cycle had begun anew. Tony had always been skeptical of these rumors. Superstition, he'd always said. But recently, doubt had spread across his logic like a thin sheet of ice. At night, he had started hearing whispers from the forest. Sounds initially mistaken for the wind were gradually turning into an intelligible call, clearly whispering Tony's name. Mr. Eldridge called down from the top of the stairs, his voice harsh and deep. "Tony! Are you finished? Hurry up, it's getting dark, and I don't want anyone wandering outside at night." When Tony went upstairs, he noticed the expression on the old man's face. Pure, unadulterated fear. "Mr. Eldridge, what's wrong?" Tony asked, wiping the blood from his hand with a white rag. The old butcher handed Tony a newspaper clipping he had received that morning. The headline was terrifying. "Sarah Jenkins missing. 7-year investigation continues." Mr. Eldridge whispered, his voice trembling. "The symbol. Tony." They found it again at the forest's edge. That ancient symbol. A cold stone settled in Tony's stomach. The 3 interconnected rings mentioned in every tale he'd heard about the town's past. It was the most concrete, most archaic signature of terror. The depth beneath Blackwood Creek's silence was finally beginning to pull him in. When Tony returned home, the air inside was cold and heavy. His mother, Clara, lay on her bed, her expressionless eyes fixed on the ceiling. Tony sat down gently beside her. "Mom, I'm home." Clara's eyes slowly shifted to him. Her voice was barely a whisper. "Tony, it's not your fault." "What are you talking about, Mom?" "The forest. They're back. Those rings. That symbol." His mother reached out a trembling hand and gripped Tony's arm. "You have to leave, son. This place doesn't belong to you anymore. It's its home. And now they want you. They know your name." Clara's face twisted, and a moan escaped her throat. It was a sound of disgust rather than pain. It was as if she sensed the presence of something else in the room besides Tony. She strained to sit up slightly and clutched her son's arm fiercely. The symbol. On the walls. Tony looked at the walls. There was nothing. But when he turned back, there was a terrifying clarity in his mother's eyes. "They want to touch you, Tony. The 7-year cycle has marked you." Tony wanted to believe this nonsense was a symptom of his mother's illness, but the whispers, Eldridge's fear, and the certainty in his mother's words gnawed at his logic. "Who are they, Mom?" He took a deep breath. "What do they want with me?" No answer came. Clara had fallen silent. It was as if the recent terror had suddenly subsided beneath cool waters. Tony covered his mother with a thick blanket and sighed, moving away from her side. As he left the room, he left the door ajar, just in case, so he could hear her voice easily. The next day, to understand the situation, Tony went to the town's oldest library. The librarian, Mrs. Gable, was reputed to be one of the town's most ancient and all-knowing residents. If anyone knew about the ancient secrets, the cryptic symbols, and the circulating rumors, it was certainly her. Tony found Mrs. Gable. The woman peered at the young man with surprise from behind her thick glasses. "Tony Hawthorne, I didn't expect you back. Your mother." Mrs. Gable paused. "She's ill." The young man immediately got to the point to avoid talking about his mother. "Mrs. Gable, I want to talk about the missing girl, Sarah Jenkins, and that symbol." Mrs. Gable's already thin lips were now a straight line. "What happens is none of our business, Tony. Some things shouldn't be disturbed. Don't forget your family's dead to this town's secrets, young man. Some families owe more than others." "Dead? What does that mean?" "Leave now, Tony. You're courting trouble. Just do your job and keep quiet." Mrs. Gable turned her head back to her book. She had suddenly lost all interest in the young man. Tony was rattled by the old woman's hostile demeanor. As he prepared to leave the library, his eye caught one of the shelves in the local history section. A darkened handmade ledger stood out among the other volumes. Mrs. Gable seemed to sense what Tony was looking at. Her voice, filled with panic, came as a warning. "Don't touch that. It's just an old village record book. Don't worry, Mrs. Gable. I'm leaving now." When the old woman decided not to press the issue, one of the patrons appeared in front of her. With Mrs. Gable's attention diverted, Tony acted on instinct. In a swift movement, he grabbed the ledger and tucked it inside his jacket. The ledger was as cold as the young man's skin. Immediately after leaving the library, Tony went not home, but to the old, abandoned sawmill area outside of town. He found a corner in the ruin, dimly lit by street lamps, and opened the ledger. The writing on the pages was faded. The ink bled. Towards the middle of the book, the records gave way to horrific drawings and cryptic words. On one page, he found a perfect copy of the interconnected three-ring symbol. Beneath the drawing were notes in a strange language, similar to the Latin Tony had learned in university. Tony could roughly translate the words. After figuring out the logic of the word arrangement, he laboriously began to decipher the notes. "And every 7 cycles, terra antiqua, ancient earth, shall be awakened. The cycle is sealed with the blood of innocence. The terror begins when a Hawthorne is born, and that person is marked by the cycle itself." Tony's hand started to tremble. Hawthorne. He quickly flipped through the pages. The handwriting on the last line was even more frantic and crazed. 2020 SJ broken. The cycle will preserve itself. It will repeat. 7 years later, it shall offer itself. TH. SJ Sarah Jenkins. Tony whispered to himself. The name of the girl who disappeared 7 years ago was in the ledger. The 7-year cycle everyone talked about had been completed with Sarah's disappearance and the next cycle. Tony's breath hitched. TH. Tony Hawthorne. The ledger was not only listing the missing, but was marking him as the next victim. He was the target of the 2027 cycle. Suddenly, a sharp, chilling hiss rose from the dark depths of the sawmill, sounding like metal scraping against metal. The sound was large, heavy, and definitely belonged to something alive. Tony jumped up in a panic and looked toward the source of the sound. Seeing no one, he quickly walked away through the ruins. After walking for a while, he turned his head to ensure no one was behind him. Something was shining on the wall he had just passed. As he approached the darkened, massive beam, he realized the shining object was the very symbol he'd encountered everywhere. The symbol was deeply carved into the beam. It seemed to Tony that those 3 distorted spirals were slightly vibrating, even breathing. As his eyes focused on the symbol, he saw the light vanish for a moment, and in its place, a red, glowing eye appeared on the beam's dark surface. The eye was staring at him. It wasn't just seeing, it knew every moment deep within Tony's mind. Tony suppressed a scream and ran. As he ran, he heard a chorus rising from inside the sawmill, like the combination of 1,000 different voices. The voice was repeating only one name: Tony. Tony. Hawthorne. The young man slammed the door behind him when he reached the house, locked it tightly, and rushed to his mother's room. Clara was again lying motionless, staring at the ceiling. In a low voice, she asked her son, "Did you see it?" "Yes, I saw the symbol." "Mom, what is this? Why is my surname in that ledger?" Clara took a deep breath. "There are things I need to tell you, son, before it's too late." "Tell me," Tony said. Clara struggled to sit up and began to speak. "You heard as a child that Blackwood Creek paid a price to the Awakened One every 7 years. It seemed like a fairy tale to you then. Everything you heard is true." She took a shaky breath and continued. "That price is innocence. And our family, the Hawthornes, was one of the first families to make this pact. In short, our ancestors led the cycle for years." Tony was stunned. "Then why are we the sacrificial candidates now?" Clara held Tony's hand. Her hand was cold. 7 years ago, the victim of the cycle should have been your sister, Sarah." Lightning struck in Tony's mind. His sister's name was Sarah, but she had left the town years ago and never returned. I couldn't let her go," Clara whispered. "I broke the pact. That ancient entity demands the innocence of a victim. I was no longer innocent, so I couldn't sacrifice myself, but I did something to distract the entity. I offered it. A different offering." Tony wiped his sweaty hands on his trousers. "What do you mean, different offering?" "I diverted its energy to someone else. That night, I ensured it found Sarah Jenkins, one of the town's most innocent and vulnerable, instead of the real Sarah. And ever since then, that ancient entity has been rotting me away. My illness, it's its punishment. My sacrificing someone else only delayed it by 7 years." Tony recoiled in horror. His mother had sacrificed another girl's life to save his sister, and now she was paying the price. Clara, through her tears, whispered with her last strength, "Now the cycle is reset. It demands a true Hawthorne sacrifice. You are the last innocent Hawthorne. If you aren't sacrificed, the Awakened One will take the town's soul, and then everyone will die." Clara's last strength gave out. "Go, Tony. The only way to save Blackwood Creek is to break this curse, but to break it, you must find its source. The source is in the missing ledger." At that moment, a creaking sound was heard from outside the house. Someone was ringing the doorbell. Tony jumped up in a panic. He realized his mother's breathing had stopped. Clara, with a final whisper, "Run," she said, and her eyes closed forever. Tony squeezed his mother's hand. "Mom." When no answer came, he shook her a few times, begging her to open her eyes. The doorbell downstairs kept ringing. This was no neighbor or friend. This was someone coming to take him. Tony looked out the window. A figure in a black robe, their face obscured, stood at the door. The figure was continuously ringing the bell with one hand and holding a torch with green flames in the other. Tony was trapped between the locked door and his mother's corpse. He had to escape. The ancient ledger in his possession was his only hope and his only proof. He would do everything he could to avenge his mother and all the innocent victims. When the doorbell rang harshly one more time, Tony looked out the window one last time. Hawthorne! A muffled, echoing voice filtered through the thick wooden door. The sound had the judging tone of Mr. Eldridge's voice. Tony knew the door was about to be broken down. He quickly surveyed the room, formulating the best escape plan. Their house had a small kitchen balcony facing the forest. The branches of the decaying cedar tree next to the balcony reached the railing. This was his only chance. He looked at his mother one last time. Clara lay with an expression of peace on her face, as if relieved of the burden of passing the curse on to the next generation. Tony didn't allow guilt or grief to choke him. All he wanted was to escape and break the curse. Tony silently opened the window. The cold, damp Blackwood Creek air rushed in. As he tightly wrapped his jacket around his body, he felt the presence of the ancient ledger inside. The fate of the entire town rested on this ledger. The sounds from below were intensifying. The door lock mechanism was being forced and was about to break. Open the door, sacrifice. Your death is inevitable. Tony clung to the branches, dropped himself from the balcony, and landed on the damp wood. Slowly, he reached for the thick, low branch of the cedar tree. He stepped onto the large trunk and looked down. It was about 4 meters to the ground. The jump was risky, but when he heard the sound of the door breaking, he had no time to hesitate. The entrance door burst open with a crash. Tony let himself drop. He landed hard on pine needles and wet soil. His knees and elbows hurt, but he had to get up. He could hear the footsteps of the robed figures entering the house. It was midnight, and the Blackwood Creek forest was breathing with its living darkness. The forest was a challenging test that Tony had to pass. But right now, he had no choice but to enter this dark vault. Tony plunged into the trees. He tried not to look back as he ran, but with a momentary reflex he turned his head and saw 3 robed figures spreading into the forest from the front of the house. All of them held those green flame torches. The torchlight was strangely strong, tearing through the darkness and illuminating the damp leaves on the forest floor in a strange, sickly hue. Their target was Tony, and they were coming to hunt. Tony ran breathlessly through the forest labyrinth surrounding the town. Memories from his childhood seemed to whisper to him which way to go. His steps led him to Blackwood Pass. According to rumors, the town's founding ancestors had made the pact with the awakened one here. Because of its dangerous reputation, families never let their children near Blackwood Pass. The presence of the ledger in his chest gave him strength. As he ran, he hid behind a tree and regulated his breathing. After checking behind him, he quickly took out the ledger. The pages were damp from the sweat on his hands. Tony couldn't stop sweating whenever he was stressed. He wiped his wet hand on his trousers to avoid damaging the pages. One of the pages, other than the notes about the cycle and the victims, caught Tony's attention. Beneath the ring symbol, a sketch of a well was drawn. The spiral well was surrounded by pine roots, and 4 standing stones stood around it. The Latin translation of the note next to the sketch was, "The origin of the curse is sealed in the spiral well. The power of the 7-year cycle rests at the bottom of that well, in the serpent's den." To break the seal, the shadow of the four stones must converge at the point where the first blood was spilled. Tony felt that these codes might be the key to solving the curse. Was the place called the Serpent's Den, an old well deep within Blackwood Pass? The green light emitted by the torches was getting closer. They were searching for him. The awakened one itself must be directing the robed figures. Tony put the ledger back into his jacket and continued running. After over an hour of pursuit, he finally reached Blackwood Pass. The trees were denser here, and Tony struggled to breathe under the heavy air. When he reached the very center of the pass, he saw a stone well, surrounded by massive, moss-covered stones. The structure, around which four standing stones rose, was hidden in the darkness. Tony approached the well cautiously. He lifted the rotten wooden cover and leaned into it, but he could see no water or anything that might help break the curse. Finding no clue, he drew back and focused on the standing stones rising around him. The ominous energy emanating from the colossal stones emitted a chilling coldness. 3 areas around the well, in a circular shape, were covered with decayed branches and plants. It was as if the curse had consumed the life around it, leaving behind an empty shell. Tony opened the ledger and compared the location of the stones with the drawing around the well. After translating a few more lines, he found a more terrifying paragraph about the nature of the awakened one. It is not an entity, it is a need. It is the land's hunger for blood. The settlers made a pact with the land when they settled here. According to the pact, an innocent victim shall be sacrificed to the land every 7 years, and the land's hunger shall be satisfied. If it is not satiated, the land will reclaim every life it has blessed the town with through a slow and painful decay. This explained his mother's illness. When Clara broke the cycle of sacrifice, the land had turned its wrath on the family targeted as the town's sacrificial candidate, the Hawthornes. His mother's illness was a deadly, tiny warning given by the land. And now, it was Tony's turn. People referred to this entity as a god. He looks more like a murderer than a god, Tony thought. He reread what he needed to do to break the cursed seal. The shadow of the 4 stones must converge at the point where the first blood was spilled. It was past midnight. The moon barely filtered through the thick clouds. The moonlight created the shadows of the stones around the well. However, the shadows fell at random points. The point where the first blood was spilled. Tony murmured. This was where the founding ancestors had sealed the pact. The pact had been sealed with a victim's blood. Tony was struck by a terrifying idea. The symbol, the 3 rings, represented a continuous cycle. The cycle was fed by blood. To break the curse, he needed to disrupt the cycle itself. He examined the ledger again. In one corner of the pages, there was a barely visible additional note. The reversal of the seal is carried out by the victim's own will. The cycle cannot be broken from the outside. Tony remembered his mother's words. I broke the pact. Clara had distracted the cycle with a different victim. But Tony needed to shatter the cycle. Hearing rustling sounds from within the forest, he immediately turned his head. The light of the green torches illuminated the path they were taking. The robed figures had arrived. Tony was running out of time. He had to do something. He took a large pocket knife from his pocket and looked at the well. It was a crazy idea, but no other solution came to mind. Sacrifice meant blood. The cycle demanded the victim's will. He opened his left palm and pressed the sharp tool into his skin. The pain hit his brain like an instant shock. Blood slowly began to ooze and drip from his palm. He approached one of the stones around the well and placed his hand on it. The moment the blood touched the stone, the carvings on it trembled and emitted a pale red light. Tony quickly dripped his blood onto the remaining 3 stones as well. The moment the blood met the 4th stone, a strange wail rose from the depths of the well. It was as if someone inside was roaring in anger, in pain. Tony focused on the ground between the 4 stones he had sealed with his blood. As the clouds moved away from the moon, the shadows of the stones stretched toward the well's mouth and converged there. The prophecy in the ledger was fulfilled. The point where the first blood was spilled, the place where the curse began, was locked by the shadows. The wail turned into an unbearable scream. A thick, red spiral of smoke began to rise from inside the well. The smoke had chilled the air. This was the energy of the awakened one. Tony stumbled backward, moving away from the well. The smoke rapidly took shape in the air. It looked like a serpent's head, but it was a fluid mass constantly changing size and shape. It had no eyes, yet Tony felt it was watching him. As the smoke stretched toward Tony, images of 1,000 pains, whispers, and desperation spread into his mind. Sarah Jenkins' last moments, his mother's slow decay. It was all the hunger of the land. The cycle cannot be broken. You offered yourself. The booming voice echoed in Tony's head. It was a wave of pure, ancient anger beyond mere words. The robed figures had already started running toward the well. When the man who was clearly their leader approached and lowered the cloth over his head, Tony trembled all over. The fear on Mr. Eldridge's face was gone, replaced by a frenzied fanaticism. Catch him. You will help complete the cycle. Do not anger the Ancient One. Eldridge's voice boomed through the forest. Tony was suddenly trapped between 2 fires. In front of him was the deadly energy of the Ancient One, and behind him were the townspeople who wanted to sacrifice him. Instinctively, he threw the ledger onto the wet soil by the well's edge. He sensed that the last secret in the ledger was what would break the seal. There had to be something left to do. Tony ran frantically toward the well and jumped right into the middle of the terrifying red smoke. As he let himself drop, the rules of the physical world shattered. The fall was both fast and endless. There were no rocks or water, only a wailing sound pressing on his eardrums. The wail echoed in Tony's mind. Though not entirely intelligible words, their meanings were clear: hunger, anger, sacrifice. When the smoke finally dispersed, Tony hit a hard floor. This place resembled a cave or an underground chamber. It was hard to breathe inside. The earth was damp, and the only source of light around was a green glow flickering on the cave walls. The light emanated from countless triple ring symbols carved into the cave walls and floor. Tony looked around in horror. As he walked toward the center of the cave, he saw a massive, smooth stone. He approached and examined the stone. The same symbol was found here too. Could this be the heart of the Ancient One and the source of the curse? The cave was eerily silent. There was no sound of wind or torches from outside. It was as if time and space were frozen here. Then, the green lights on the walls intensified, grew, and transparent figures began to appear along the sides of the cave. Looking at the figures suspended in the air, he realized they were human silhouettes. As they started to approach Tony, their faces were illuminated with desperation and exhaustion. He recognized one of them, Jimmy, the little boy who had disappeared 14 years ago. Right next to him, the spirit of Sarah Jenkins appeared. Each of them was a victim feeding the hunger of the land. Sarah Jenkins stretched out her hand toward Tony. When she spoke, the words echoed in his mind like a whisper. Pain, hunger, no escape, only surrender. Tony recoiled in horror. I didn't come to hurt you. I only want to break the cycle. Tony's words echoed in the silence of the cave. The innocent souls backed away for a moment, but older, harsher figures emerged from the darkest corners of the cave. These were the deceased members of the Council of Elders, the town's founding ancestors. There was neither regret nor pain on their faces, only authority and arrogance. One of the figures approached Tony with a familiar sternness. Tony recognized this face from an old photograph. Tony's great-great-grandfather and one of the first Hawthorns who made the town's founding pact, Elias Hawthorne. You, Elias Hawthorne's spirit thundered. His voice, like the cracking of rocks, echoed in the void. The seed of the traitor. You followed your mother who broke the cycle. My mother protected her children, Tony countered. She chose to sacrifice her life rather than feed that cursed land with her own children's blood. Elias let out a cold, vile laugh. We founded Blackwood Creek. We secured its prosperity. These lands demand sacrifice to thrive, and we protect our own blood by offering the weakest. This was a necessary sacrifice. No, Tony said, his voice shaky but resolute. This was a betrayal. You used the blood of innocents to protect your own power, and now this curse is destroying the entire town. Elias's spirit flared with anger. The curse is harming the town because of you. You broke the cycle. The land is hungry now. If the hunger is not satisfied, every inch of this land will decay. Your duty was to be the sacrifice, just like your mother should have been. Tony squeezed the knife in his hand and retorted. So you were after me because you knew I wouldn't agree to be the sacrifice, didn't you? You also must have known that when I dripped my blood into the well, I would find a way to break the curse. Tony tried to detach himself from the desperation of the innocent spirits and the arrogant rage of the founders. His focus had to be on the heart of the symbol in the center of the cave. He had left the ancient ledger by the well, but he remembered its contents. The nature of the Ancient One was simply a need, and the only way to break a need was not to satisfy it, but to destroy it. The breaking of the curse. This cycle must have started somewhere. There must have been a first seal, Tony thought. He looked at Elias Hawthorne's spirit. Who initiated the pact? Who first spoke to the land? Elias wore a mocking expression. We, your ancestors. We founded Blackwood. No. The place where the first blood was spilled. It was written in the ledger. The shadow of the 4 stones must converge at the point where the first blood was spilled. I spilled my blood and locked the cycle here. But initially, whose blood sealed the pact? Elias's spirit trembled for a moment. The arrogance in his eyes was replaced by a momentary fear. Tony knew he had found the key. This pact was an offering to the land, but it was also sealed by human will. The first victim wasn't a stranger, was it? Tony whispered. The first victim was one of the pact makers. One of your own blood, not just innocence. A strong will was required. The air inside the cave was freezing cold. The wail coming from the heart of the Ancient One was rising. Elias Hawthorne's spirit was finally shaken. Damn it. Yes, the Ancient One demanded not only the young but a powerful spirit, and we offered that spirit. She was the strongest spirit among us. She was the true seal. Tony exploited the opening Elias's spirit gave him. Who was she? Whose blood did you use to start this curse? Elias screamed with hatred, the most innocent and knowledgeable among us. She was my sister. We offered her because her spirit would suppress the land's hunger for a long time. A momentary flash struck Tony's mind. The ancient ledger. The ledger was filled with the handwriting of the town's founders. The ledger was not just a record, it was the contract of the curse. Tony muttered to himself. He had left the ledger outside, by the well's edge. The information he needed to break the curse was not physically with him. However, he remembered something. His mother had told him the last note in the ledger. The reversal of the seal is carried out by the victim's own will. Tony looked at the knife in his hand, still bearing his own blood, which had activated the cycle's mechanism. He approached the heart of the Ancient One. Tony could hear the whispers of the spirits and the angry shouts of the founders. Elias's spirit screamed in a panic, "Stop! Don't touch it! If that seal is broken, the land will reclaim all the energy it gave the town in a single moment. Everyone will die, including you." Tony paused. This was his final decision, to be a victim or to save everyone. Tony moved toward the stone. He could feel the power lying beneath the triple ring symbol. "The pact you made," Tony whispered, looking at the stone. "The product of your cowardice. By sacrificing your own blood, you also sacrifice the town's conscience." Tony placed his injured hand on the heart of the Ancient One. The moment his blood touched the stone, the symbol's red glow turned into a white light. An incredible spiral of energy enveloped the young man's entire body. This energy was the combination of the land's ancient hunger and the pain of the sacrificed souls. The cave began to shake. The green lights on the walls went out one by one. The spirits of Elias Hawthorne and the other founders began to scatter, screaming. Tony was breaking the curse they had brought upon the town. With his last strength, he shouted, "I am not the sacrifice. I am the salvation of Blackwood Creek, and this cycle is broken." The entire cave was shaken by a destructive clap of thunder. The heart of the Ancient One began to crack through the center of the symbol under Tony's will. As the innocent souls and the founders were sucked back into the well in a spiral of light, Tony lost consciousness with a loud explosion. Slowly regaining consciousness, the young man's body was trembling in pain, as if it had been subjected to an electric current for hours. When he opened his eyes, he was lying on the wet, damp soil by the well. Everything was over. The heart of the Ancient One, where Tony had placed his hand, was split in two. The triple ring symbol had faded on the stone surface, turning into a mundane, powerless scratch. The cave had dissolved as if it had never existed. Along with Tony's loss of consciousness, the dimension where the Ancient One resided had vanished. He stood up and climbed the steps he hadn't noticed before. As he scrambled out of the well, the surrounding forest was draped in a dull silence. There was no howl of the wind, no sound of birds or the animals. Most importantly, there were no traces of the green torches or the robed figures waiting behind him. The lost souls and the founders had been pulled back into the land with the broken seal. The cycle of the curse was finally over. Tony walked toward the town with weary steps. Hours later, when the first light of morning reached Blackwood Creek, he arrived at the town's gates. The sight that greeted him was unsettling. The town was completely abandoned. The doors of the shops were open. Some cars were stopped in the middle of the street, only their headlights blinking. The place that had been lively and crowded seconds ago was now empty. Tony stopped without hesitation in front of the butcher shop. The meats inside lay on the counters as if they had been abandoned instantly. The air was heavy with a mix of a sharp cold and stale blood odor. Tony leaned against the shop door and took a deep breath. It would take a long time for life to return to the town, but at least the curse was over, and Blackwood Creek was now free from the cycle's grip. The curse was broken, but the Ancient One had taken a final price. The spirit of the founders had whispered to Tony that if the cycle was broken, the land would reclaim everything it had given the town in an instant. Tony realized that this reclamation did not mean a physical death. The curse had already consumed the town's soul. The council of elders and the townsfolk who obeyed them had long lost their souls while alive. Now they, too, had dissolved into the silence like the souls lost in the eternal cycle. Blackwood Creek had instantly turned into a ghost town covered in fog. Tony headed toward the house he shared with his mother. The door was askew from being forced open by Mr. Eldridge and the others. When he entered, he saw that his mother's bed was still the same. Clara lay with a peaceful expression. Since she had died hours earlier, the price taken by the land had not affected his mother's body. Tony sat by his mother and held her hand. "It's over, Mom. The curse is over, but the price..." Just then, there was another movement in the house. He heard a slow, limping sound coming from the stairs. Tony immediately jumped to his feet and drew the knife from his pocket. The person descending the stairs was the librarian, Mrs. Gable. The vitality on her face was gone, leaving behind a vacant mask. Her eyes shone like chalky glass, devoid of any sign of life. Mrs. Gable slowly walked toward Tony. In her hand was the ledger that Tony had dropped by the well. "You did it," Mrs. Gable said. Her voice was not her own. It was a muffled, echoing tone. "Congratulations. The will of the Hawthorne managed to break the cycle. But you only freed yourself, Tony. You destroyed all of us. You destroyed yourselves," Tony countered. Sustaining a pact by sacrificing the innocent was a greater crime than breaking the curse. Mrs. Gable raised the ledger in her hand and laughed. "The curse will take you too. The awakened one's power may be broken, but the Council of Elders has one last duty. Before the curse is completely extinguished, we must take the last Hawthorne." Mrs. Gable lunged at Tony. Her movements were slow, but she possessed incredible strength. Tony saw that the woman's old body carried all the fury of the Council of Elders. He quickly retreated. Mrs. Gable's goal was to use the ledger to offer one final sacrifice. Mrs. Gable approached, trying to press the ledger into Tony's chest. Tony grabbed one of the fireplace shovels across the bed to defend himself and held it in front of him. Silence. That is the only path for Blackwood Creek, eternal silence. Tony pushed the ledger out of Mrs. Gable's hand and struck the shovel with all his might against the woman's soulless chest. The blow had a greater impact than he expected. Mrs. Gable's body recoiled like a puppet, and her lifeless eyes fixed on the ceiling. However, as Mrs. Gable fell to the floor, the ledger flew from her hand, hit the ground, and its pages scattered in the air. As the ledger scattered, a faint, warm breeze spread through the house around Tony. It smelled of peace. The curse had truly ended. Tony looked at Mrs. Gable's lifeless body. She and the other Council of Elders had become the final victims of the cycle they created. They had sacrificed the soul, the ultimate price of the Ancient One. Tony gathered the scattered ledger pages together. These pages were the proof of the town's terrifying past and its pact. A few days later, Tony was still in Blackwood Creek. He was the only living person in the silent, foggy, and abandoned town. As he walked the streets, the silence of the empty shops and stopped cars both unnerved and provided a sense of relief. The forest surrounding the town was still silent, but it was no longer threatening. The faint breeze filtering through the trees, the chirping of birds, and the smell of pine made it feel as if nature was finally breathing after a long illness. Leaves rustled against each other, shadows moved slowly, and the ground radiated a living peace. Tony stood in the town square. With every step, he felt the dampness of the earth, the coldness of the stones. He was slowly gathering the town's former energy within himself. Peace wouldn't come instantly, but with the breaking of the curse, Blackwood Creek had become a safe place. He felt both an exhaustion and a faint hope inside him. He had left the weight of the past behind. Only an uncertain but free void remained for the future. The town's silence promised a rebirth. Tony buried his mother beneath the pine trees on a hilly area outside the town. He also buried Mrs. Gable's body next to her. The past and future of Blackwood Creek lay on this silent hill. Now a difficult choice lay ahead of him. He could completely abandon the town and start a new life elsewhere. Now that the terror was over, he had no reason to stay here. Yet the idea of staying and rebuilding Blackwood Creek lingered in his mind. Knowing the town's past, making a new beginning, and not repeating the old mistakes would be a clean slate. Tony remembered his mother's final wish. Go, Tony. The only way to save Blackwood Creek is to break this curse. He had broken the curse. Now, the town's future depended on his will. Tony slowly walked to the town square with the scattered pages of the ancient ledger in his hand. As the wind passed through the pages, it seemed to whisper the old words again. These were words that did not want to be forgotten, but that should no longer exist. Tony held his breath, took a small lighter from his pocket. As the flame licked the edges of the pages, the dark knowledge within the ledger began to turn to ash one by one. The paper shriveled, the symbols curled, the ink blackened. Within minutes, all the evidence of the past had turned into a pile of grey ash, scattered by the wind in Blackwood Creek's silent square. When the flames died down, leaving behind the sharp smell of smoke, Tony stood silently over the ashes. No curse will remain, he whispered to himself. After a few hours of indecision, he decided to stay in Blackwood Creek. The curse was broken, and this would be the beginning of a new era, not a new cycle. Tony looked at the silent town square. At 25, he had become a hero, a survivor, and the new founder of Blackwood Creek. Months passed. Tony worked to revive the town. Slowly, people from the outside world began to take interest in the abandoned town. Instead of telling every visitor the secrets of the past, Tony simply said the town was suddenly abandoned. New families began to arrive. Blackwood Creek was breathing again, albeit slowly. Tony repaired the butcher shop and reorganized the library. The town had started to host the sun again. However, mystery and fear did not completely leave him alone. When Tony was alone at night, he sometimes thought he heard a faint whisper coming from between the pine trees. Was this his paranoia? Or had the remnants of the Ancient One never fully erased themselves from his mind? A year later, the town was completely filled with new residents. Tony was now the town's unofficial mayor. Everyone sought his advice, and no one knew his past exactly. One evening, as he read the local town newspaper, he noticed the news of the grand opening of the newly established high school. Tony folded the newspaper and placed it on the table, letting out a weary breath. At that moment, a small photograph on the folded corner of the newspaper caught his eye. The photograph showed the front facade of the new high school building. A carefully carved ornate rosette shone above the main entrance. Tony's heart stopped for a moment. The rosette was elegant, looking like a brand new design. But Tony knew that symbol all too well. The three interconnected rings. He froze in his seat. He had broken the curse. He had destroyed the heart of the Ancient One. But clearly, the cycle had not been completely erased from the town's soul. The land would always find a way. The current generation, without even realizing it, had recreated the old seal. The curse hadn't left. It was merely dormant. Tony knew that the day would come, and the cycle would begin anew. Who would be the first victim of the new cycle, and when? As these questions echoed in his mind, the town's noise turned into an almost inaudible whisper. Silence was now a sign not only of peace, but of an approaching darkness. Tony took a deep breath. The tips of his fingers on the table still remembered the texture of the ancient ledger. The ledger was no longer with him, but the secrets and ancient rituals within it still lived in his mind. The darkness was breathing in the shadows and possibilities, just as it once had. For Tony Hawthorne, the silent struggle in Blackwood Creek was not yet over, and somewhere in the depths of the town, the ancient three-ring seal was waiting to reawaken.